Ballen is so good with his titles, and I'm so bad at leaving my earphones in from the last reaction. He's so good with his titles that you get you so engrossed in what this story's going to be about. This one sounds like it's going to be a little bit gruesome. So if you've got a bit of a sicky stomach or a soft stomach, then don't watch. His skull was melting, and no one knew why. That's what it says. We've got to listen to this. Right, okay, if this is the first time being here, I've seen any of my reactions, then please hit like and subscribe. It supports me, it supports the channel, and I do appreciate it. And don't forget to follow Mr. Ballen, who's clearly had a shave. Right, let's go.
Today, I'm going to tell you 3 medical mysteries.
Three.
And all of these stories end with diagnoses that are so bizarre, they'll leave you thinking,
Diagnoses?
I didn't even know that was possible. But
Is diagnoses a word? Is it not diagnosis? Diagnoses. Has he messed that word up? Okay.
before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's laundry.
Okay.
But don't tell them you're gonna do their laundry in their dishwasher. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
I mean, I'm sure the dishwasher would still wash the clothes, wouldn't it? To be honest, I'm sure it would. Tomato. Kyle said he should play on easy. Well, Kyle's instructed him wrong. It's not the best experience. The leak. Let's go.
One morning in 2017, a 25-year-old man named Watanabe Takuya stumbled into the Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. Takuya felt sweaty and feverish, and his head was pounding, and he also had one hand kind of cupped over his right ear because his ear was literally leaking fluid.
Ooh.
But Takuya was not scared by these symptoms. Instead, he actually felt sort of annoyed because this was actually not the first time these symptoms had happened to him.
Oh, okay.
So Takuya had this long history of something known as cholesteatoma, which is basically a recurring cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal.
Right.
When he was a teenager, he'd had multiple surgeries to have this cyst removed and keep it from coming back. And for almost a decade now, it had seemed like the surgeries had worked because the cyst had stayed gone. But about 2 weeks earlier, he'd begun having this constant drainage coming out of his ear, which was, a sign that the cyst was back. Now, when this began happening, initially he had sort of put off going back to the hospital, but now he was pretty sure the cyst had caused him to develop an ear infection, which would now explain his fever and his headache, and so here he was.
Ear infections are no joke. Oof, no, the bad ear infections, no, not for me.
To develop an ear infection, which would now explain his fever and his headache, and so here he was. So Takuya made his way to the check-in desk at the hospital with one hand still kind of keeping the liquid in his ear.
Right.
And as he's standing there, he explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist, who nodded, took down all of his information and quickly admitted him to the emergency room.
Right.
About half an hour later, Takuya was laying in his emergency room bed with his eyes closed because the light in the room was so intense it was, making his headache worse. But even with his eyes closed, he knew there was a hospital doctor standing right beside his bed. And he listened as the doctor went over the results of some of the tests they had run.
Okay.
The doctor said that based on Takuya's medical history and the fluid clearly leaking out of his ear, they were pretty sure that he was right, and that his cyst had returned and led to what was now a severe ear infection. He said that very likely Takuya would have to have another surgery to get rid of the cyst again. But the doctor didn't want to operate just yet, because he said they had an even bigger problem to deal with first. Based on the preliminary blood tests, the doctor said it looked like Takuya's ear infection had gotten so bad that the infection had actually spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. And this was obviously extremely dangerous, primarily because it could lead to permanent brain damage and even death. And when Takuya heard this, on one hand, he was obviously shocked. This was more than he expected, of course. But more than that, he just felt mad at himself. Because he knew that if he hadn't waited so long to come to the hospital, this infection likely wouldn't have gotten this bad. He's known about this for 2 weeks. He just kind of didn't want to deal with it.
And this is a lesson for people who won't go to the hospital or the doctors and think they can get over things themselves. If something's not right, you go.
because he knew that if he hadn't waited so long to come to the hospital,
Facts.
this infection likely wouldn't have gotten this bad. I mean, he's known about this for 2 weeks. He just kind of didn't want to deal with it, and now it was obviously much worse. But regardless, it was too late now. So Takuya, despite the light, opened up his eyes and he asked the doctor, what could they do? And the doctor said they were going to have to admit him to the hospital, not just the emergency room, and start him on a very powerful dose of antibiotics.
Yes.
2 weeks later, Takuya was still in the hospital. And at this point, he was actually lying on his back and he was being basically rolled inside of a CT machine, which basically is like this big white ring that goes over your head and it scans the inside of your head. So by this point, the antibiotics he'd been prescribed had worked and Takuya's infection had been cured. But despite that, his ear was still leaking fluid on and off, not constantly, but it was definitely still happening.
Okay.
So because of that, hospital doctors had ordered this CT scan specifically so they could look inside of Takuya's head and basically map out exactly how they were going to operate on his ear. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes while the CT scan machine took pictures of the inside of his head. And then when it was done, a nurse pulled him out and then led him back to his hospital room. And then a little while later, a hospital doctor came into the room holding some papers, and the doctor told Takuya that, based on the CT scan he had just done, he actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. And immediately, Takuya felt so happy and so relieved because he thought, another surgery was practically inevitable. But that happy feeling only lasted for about a second. Because then the doctor, who, just delivered this news, sort of shifted and had this really troubled look come over his face. And they told Takuya that, well, the reason you don't need another surgery is because there is no cyst in your ear at all. The real problem that was causing all of your symptoms was much, much worse. Then, from his stack of papers, the doctor handed Takuya an image from the CT scan. And when Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he saw. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It happens when a person's body just randomly starts breaking down and consuming their own bones. And in Takuya's case, his skull was now literally disappearing, almost like a melting ice cube. And that fluid that was leaking out of his ear was brain fluid that was now basically flowing through the holes in his skull.
Oh, shit. Oh, my God. Can you imagine being told that your bones are disappearing? You're just going to end up being like a floppy person on the floor with... Oh, my God, that's... Whoa. Ooh, that's minging, isn't it?
Like a melting ice cube. And that fluid that was leaking out of his ear was brain fluid that was now basically flowing through the holes in his skull.
Wow.
Now, unfortunately, at the time of the story and still today, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is basically plug up the holes where they begin to disintegrate. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. They used this special glue and literally kind of plugged up the holes in his skull. But amazingly, it sort of worked because Takuya's doctors monitored him for bone loss and fluid leakage after they did this, and as of his most recent checkup in 2018, at least in terms of what's been publicly released, he appeared to be doing quite well.
So they did cure him, sort of. I mean, what a crazy, crazy situation that is. Look at those brain scans there. Holes are just appearing in his skull. I mean, there's some messed up diseases in this world, but that's just bizarre. That is one of the most bizarrest diseases I've ever heard of. Wow. So they cemented him back up. Right, on to the next story. It's going to be, yeah. It felt like it was going to be an advert. Right, the 7th time. But what is the 7th time?
One afternoon in late January of 2018, A father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 kids shared inside of his house in Madison, Wisconsin. Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes and threw them right in the garbage. Then he sprayed the counters, the sink, the mirror, basically every surface he could see with disinfectant and began wiping everything down.
Right.
So Dan was doing this because he, his wife, and their 3 kids all had strep throat. And according to their doctor, the best way to get rid of it was basically to
disinfect
have
everything.
everybody take antibiotics and to deep clean the house to get rid of all the bacteria that had caused the infection. However, as Dan, followed protocol and scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt sort of frustrated because this was not actually the first time that his whole family had come down with strep. Over just the last 4 months, his whole family had gotten strep 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took or how many times they deep cleaned the house and all the bathrooms, it's like they always got sick again.
Is he sure it's strep throat and not a recurring virus, a different reoccurring virus? Maybe it was misdiagnosed. Because strep throat doesn't normally come back and come back and come back, especially when you're using antibiotics as well. Unless it was viral, because antibiotics is just for bacterial infections, isn't it? You can get viral versions, can't you?
They deep cleaned the house and all the bathrooms. It's like they always got sick again. And this was really baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist, and so he knew a lot about bacteria. And he'd already explored practically every option for where this repeated strep infection could be coming from. Nobody else at his or his wife's work was getting sick, and neither was anybody at his kid's school or daycare. So he knew it couldn't be coming from any of those places. But this didn't make any sense either, because each time they got strep, all 6 times, Dan and his wife, systematically disinfected like the entire house. I mean, really overboard, cleaning every surface.
Right.
So if there was bacteria somewhere in the house, it had to have been cleaned up by now. But it was like somehow the bacteria was surviving the disinfecting.
Maybe it's airborne. Maybe it's airborne. And it's coming from something outside when they open the doors or the windows or something.
He just didn't know where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully went about, disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time here. Then when he was done, he went into the kitchen where he had his whole family's antibiotic prescriptions stacked up on the counter. Dan took his own and then also grabbed doses for everybody else. Dan brought antibiotics to his 2 daughters, who were 6 and 3 years old, and who were also both lying in their beds looking completely miserable. Then he went into his and his wife's room, where he found his wife sitting up in bed, cuddling with their very sick 1-year-old son.
Right.
Dan handed his wife the antibiotics and then looked down at his son. He looked so small and vulnerable, and it just killed Dan to think how many times this poor kid had been sick and how powerless he was to help him. Dan didn't know what else to do here.
That.
He and his wife were following doctor's orders here, but this is, again, the 6th time, and clearly nothing's changing, so the advice is not really helping. It just sort of felt like they were trapped and couldn't get out of this awful situation. But then, as Dan was standing there feeling sort of defeated, he thought of something. His mother was a retired pediatrician, and she might have different advice for how to handle this. So he sat down in bed, took out his phone, and he called his mom to ask for help. And Dan's mom actually did have a theory about where this strep bacteria was coming from and how to get rid of it. But because Dan was, a biologist and really understood how bacteria functioned, he knew her theory was sort of out there. Like most scientists and medical professionals, for that matter, would say that his mom's theory was basically not possible. But at this point, Dan and his family were desperate enough that they were all ready to try something new. So Dan decided he would try out his mother's theory.
I hope she's right.
And so he began looking for an expert to help him do that. But all the experts Dan got in touch with, when they heard about what this theory really entailed, they turned it down. Like nobody
they won't entertain it. They all think they know better. Umbrella, Resident Evil. They all think they know better, don't they? That's the trouble with a lot of people these days. They always think they know better. Never want to stray off the path of someone else's knowledge.
They heard about what this theory really entailed. They turned it down. Like nobody was prepared to do this. And so for Dan, it felt like he was, right on the cusp of maybe finding the answer here and maybe curing, his family of this horrible problem. But no medical professionals would even entertain it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside of a hospital room sitting next to his wife, and they were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen mask, because she'd gotten strep throat for a 7th time.
Wow.
And this time, she'd gotten so sick, she'd also developed pneumonia.
Shit.
And so realistically, at this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. And for Dan, I mean, he was on the verge of a complete breakdown here. He was convinced that the only way to protect his kids was to find somebody who would test his mother's theory, but Dan and his wife had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state. And so Dan really didn't know who to turn to at this point. But as they sat in the hospital room, watching their toddler fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him and said, "What if instead of asking medical professionals for help, what if we try asking medical students? Maybe a student would be more willing to test out this theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy." Dan agreed. At this point, it was definitely worth a try. It's last chance saloon, isn't it? So they reached out to the University of Wisconsin. And this final Hail Mary actually worked. On April 4th, 2018, so about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they'd contacted then analyzed this thing and was determined after their analysis that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct.
What was it?
It would turn out Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat.
Was it that cat?
There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat.
Shit.
Now, most veterinarians didn't believe that cats could even catch strep, let alone transmit it to humans. So they all refused to test the family's cat. That's why they kept saying no. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin Veterinary School that a student finally agreed to do it. And lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain that the family kept on catching. Their cat kept giving them strep.
So I bet all those people who wouldn't help him now, fuck him. Don't give him the information. You know what I mean? No, you'd have to do that because they can do it in the future if it happens again. But do you know what I mean? All them people who refuse to help and everything, I hope they fucking feel guilty.
Strain that the family kept on catching. Their cat kept giving them strep. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would make a full recovery from her pneumonia. And after another round of antibiotics, including antibiotics for the cat, and one more deep clean of the house, the family's strep throat finally went away for good.
This is why I don't have cats. It's not. I just don't have cats. Wow. That's a crazy story, that one. See, now you can't not have a death in a Mr. Ballen video now, can we? This one's called The Death House. Maybe he's saving the best for last. Or the worst for last, shall we say.
On September 30th, 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany.
Right.
Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath and then unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. So Charlotte was here because both of her parents had suddenly died just a few days ago. They'd only been 70 and 76 years old, and they had both been in good health. But her father had suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen. Christ. And when her mother found him, she also had a heart attack, apparently out of shock. Now, Charlotte's mother had managed to call a doctor.
That's a thing, isn't it? People call it broken heart syndrome or something like that, don't they? But the thing is that shock at that age,
also had a heart attack,
get it?
Apparently out of shock.
Yeah.
Now, Charlotte's mother had managed to call a doctor, but by the time the doctor arrived, both Charlotte's dad and mom were deceased.
Oh, that's
now,
sad.
Charlotte and her husband had flown into Germany that morning from Wisconsin, where they lived. And up until this point, Charlotte really had been holding her emotions together. But now, standing in her parents' living room and looking around at all their belongings, it was like all of the grief just poured out of her, and she just broke down and sobbed. So her husband, not really knowing what else to do, just turned on the TV and sort of guided Charlotte over to the couch and told her to sit down and rest for a bit before they had dinner. They actually had plans that evening with the next door neighbor. She was this elderly woman named Caroline, and Caroline had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. And also Charlotte's uncle, Dieter, planned to come over as well after dinner since he lived nearby.
Right.
About 30 minutes later, Charlotte is still sitting on the couch, just kind of relaxing and watching TV. Caroline, the neighbor, showed up, and she showed up with 2 big bags of groceries, and she went right inside the house and right into the kitchen and began cooking. And pretty soon, the entire apartment smelled like comfort food, which made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a lot better.
Yeah.
Eventually, Caroline called out that dinner was almost ready. So at that point, Charlotte got up, she went into the kitchen and sat down at the table next to her husband. And then, after the food was served, they all ate dinner together while they waited for her uncle, Dieter, to arrive. Not long after, Uncle Dieter arrived and knocked on the front door of the apartment. But after a full minute, nobody came to the door. So he knocked again, but there was still no answer. Dieter could hear the TV on in the living room.
Death House
he couldn't hear any voices inside or...
The Death House has killed everybody. But why? Oh, was it her cooking?
Dieter could hear the TV on in the living room, but he couldn't hear any voices inside or the sound of anybody moving around inside the apartment. And so after a couple of minutes, he just decided he would let himself in. As Dieter walked through the living room, he began calling out for Charlotte, her husband, and for Caroline. But still, nobody called back. And there was no sound of anybody moving inside the apartment. It was just totally still. And so Dieter, he couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive. Like, this is weird. Like, where is everybody? What's going on? They were expecting me. He walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, and there he saw Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline all sitting at the table, eating their food. But something was wrong. All 3 of them were just sitting at the table, and their plates were, half eaten right in front of them, but nobody was moving. It was like they were all just kind of stationary, just kind of staring straight ahead. And so Dieter, he bent down and he was like, Charlotte, what's going on? What are you guys doing? But when he got a good look at Charlotte's face and Caroline's face and Charlotte's husband's face, his stomach just dropped and he backed away, totally horrified.
All dead.
What Dieter saw was so terrifying, so eerie, so awful. It actually made international news. And that apartment would even get a nickname. The Death House.
Yeah, not moving in.
Charlotte's parents did not just have spontaneous heart attacks on the same day and die. That's not what happened. It would turn out that toxic sewer gas had been leaking into the apartment through a broken pipe in the kitchen sink. That gas poisoned both of Charlotte's parents and caused their hearts to stop, basically at the same time. Now, nobody thought to check for sewer gas poison, so Charlotte and her husband came to stay at her parents' apartment without any idea that the apartment was still full of this toxic gas. And so when Dieter finally came over for dinner, he found Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline all sitting around the kitchen table, sort of frozen there because they were dead. Dieter, fortunately, after seeing this, immediately left the apartment to go call the authorities. And it was that decision that ultimately saved his life.
Wow. I mean, with gas and stuff, you'd be thinking like they'd be choking first and they wouldn't be just sat at the table like that. Like frozen in time, wouldn't you? You think they'd all be like on the floor, or they've collapsed out the chair, but just to be eating, then suddenly everyone died at once. I mean, that is bizarre. That is a bizarre turn of events for people to all die at the same time like that. That was crazy. I mean, I suppose Mr. Ballen had to make up for the other stories where people didn't really die, but could have, by just having a bizarre story in Germany. Jesus Christ. Gas leaks. Oh my God. Can you imagine walking in and then everyone's just sat there frozen? You'd be like, wouldn't you? Fucking hell. That's got to be one of the most bizarre Mr. Ballen stories we've checked out yet, that last one. Crazy. Anyway, what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to check out the original video, and I'll see you next time.